The Molasses Flood. Horrific sweet disaster. On January 15, 1919, a sound like thunder cracked through Boston's waterfront, but what followed wasn't water but a roaring 25-foot wave of molasses, thick as nightmare and fast as a train. The sticky flood snapped support beams, tossed freight cars like toys, and drowned victims in a substance sweeter than syrup, yet deadlier than quicksand. For decades, locals whispered that the streets still reeked of molasses on hot summer days. Was it grief playing tricks or something more unsettling? This wasn't some folk tale. It was America's strangest disaster, where 21 lives vanished under a sweet, suffocating tide. And the terrifying truth: the tank's collapse wasn't an accident, it was a crime, buried under a century of sugar and rust. Boston's North End was a jungle of factories and docks, where the Purity Distilling Company's 50-foot-tall molasses tank loomed like a sleeping giant. The tank groaned under its 2.3 million-gallon burden, leaking so often that children scooped molasses with buckets, while executives pocketed profits and ignored the cracks. Engineers had warned the tank was built too thin, too fast, but in an era before regulations, greed stuck harder than molasses ever could. Workers joked about the tank's eerie creaks, not realizing it was counting down to catastrophe until the clock struck 12:30 p.m. The explosion was heard for miles, a metallic scream as the tank's seams burst, first a trickle, then a tidal wave. The wave moved at 35 miles per hour, a caramel-colored avalanche crushing brick walls, flipping horses and trapping victims in a glue-like grave. By the time the sludge settled, witnesses would swear the streets looked like a war zone, if war zones smelled like rotting sugar and regret. At 12:30 p.m., the tank erupted with a deafening roar, not a slow leak, but a full-blown explosion, sending jagged steel shards slicing through the air like shrapnel. The force was so immense it knocked a freight train off its tracks, as if the 26-million-pound wave had a mind of its own, hungry for destruction. The molasses didn't just spill, it surged, a viscous tsunami reaching 25 feet high, swallowing entire buildings in seconds. Workers at the nearby firehouse had only seconds to react before the syrup smashed through their brick walls, trapping them in a sticky tomb. Horses harnessed to delivery wagons screamed as the molasses yanked them under, their thrashing limbs only speeding up the suffocation. The wave speed, 35 miles per hour, meant no one could outrun it. Victims were pinned against walls, drowned in a substance thicker than cement. Children playing in the street vanished mid-laugh, their last breaths choked by a sweetness that turned lethal. The flood ripped entire houses off their foundations, leaving behind only splintered wood and a creeping brown stain. Telephone poles snapped like twigs, their wires whipping through the air, sparking as they dragged through the wreckage. In under 30 seconds, the wave had done its damage, leaving behind a dystopian wasteland that reeked of fermentation and death. Survivors fought against the molasses like it was alive, every movement exhausting, every gasp for air filling their lungs with syrup. Rescuers arrived to a nightmare, victims encased up to their chests, their skin already turning blue from the cold and suffocation. The harder they struggled, the faster the molasses hardened, January's chill turning the flood into a deadly adhesive. Firefighters used axes to chop through the sludge, but for many it was too late, their bodies preserved like insects in amber. A worker named Martin Clougherty woke up on his floating mattress. His house had been swept 3 blocks, his sister missing. Nearby, a young clerk named George Leahy was pinned against a ceiling beam, his ribs crushed, begging for help as the molasses rose. The dead were so coated in syrup that identification was nearly impossible. Families had to recognize clothing, not faces. The cleanup took weeks. Saltwater hoses, sand, and even flamethrowers were used to melt the stubborn residue. Sniffer dogs refused to enter the area. The stench of rotting molasses mixed with decay was too overwhelming. The harbor ran brown for months, and locals claimed the sweet stench lingered for years, a ghostly reminder. In the end, 21 people died, some instantly, some slowly, all in a disaster no one had thought possible. And the question remained, who let this happen? Because this wasn't just tragedy, it was negligence. Before the molasses even stopped dripping, the lawsuits began, because this wasn't an act of God but a man-made catastrophe. The tank had been built hastily, its steel walls too thin to hold the weight of 2.3 million gallons, a disaster waiting to happen. The company claimed it was sabotage, an anarchist's bomb. Despite zero evidence, they'd rather blame radicals than admit incompetence. But investigators found the truth. The tank had leaked from day one, and instead of fixing it, workers just painted over the cracks. The tank's engineer had warned it needed reinforcement, but the company ignored him. Profits mattered more than safety. Witnesses testified that the molasses had fermented, producing gas that strained the tank, turning sweetness into a bomb. The trial dragged on for years, with victims' families forced to relive trauma while executives dodged responsibility. In the end, the company paid $628,000, barely $628,000, barely $10 million today, for 21 lives, a slap on the wrist. But the case set a legal precedent. Corporations could now be sued for negligence, a small victory in a sea of loss. The tank's blueprints vanished mysteriously, convenient for the company, suspicious for history. To this day, no one was jailed. The Molasses Flood became a footnote, unless you lived through it. And the most chilling fact, the same company kept operating, as if nothing had happened. Over time, the flood became legend, whispered as Boston's sweet tsunami, a tale so bizarre it felt invented. Some claimed the molasses was still there, buried under the city, seeping up during heat waves. Others swore they heard screams on summer nights, echoes of victims trapped in syrup a century ago. But the truth? The molasses was washed into the harbor, though traces lingered in sewer pipes for decades. Scientists later calculated the wave's power. Each gallon weighed 11 pounds, a crushing force few could survive. The sweet smell myth, likely from fermenting molasses in basements, not the streets themselves. Even the death toll was disputed. Some bodies were never found, lost in the harbor's murky depths. Modern engineers confirm the tank was a ticking time bomb, but 1919 Boston had no safety codes to stop it. The flood inspired horror stories. H.P. Lovecraft even wrote about the sticky darkness that swallowed men whole. But the real horror wasn't supernatural. It was human greed, cutting corners until the seams burst. Today, a small plaque marks the site. No museum, no memorial. Just 3 lines of text, easy to miss. And if you stand there at noon on January 15th, locals say you can still taste the air, thick, metallic, and faintly sweet. Engineers later determined the molasses wave moved with the force of a freight train, its viscosity creating a deadly non-Newtonian flow, acting like liquid and solid at once. The tank's steel was half as thick as needed, just 0.31 inches, and the rivets cracked like ice under the fermented molasses gas pressure. Modern simulations show the wave's 35 miles per hour speed was impossible to outrun. Victims had less than 30 seconds to react before being engulfed. The molasses weight, 12,000 pounds per square foot, crushed buildings so thoroughly, rescue teams mistook debris piles for intact structures. January's cold accelerated the disaster. As the molasses cooled, it thickened into quicksand, trapping victims faster than expected. Chemists found the molasses had fermented, producing CO2 gas that turned the tank into a giant pressure cooker. Sweetness transformed into a bomb. The disaster directly inspired industrial safety laws. Boston's building codes became the strictest in America by 1925. Today, fluid dynamics textbooks cite the flood as a grim lesson in gravity current physics, how dense liquids unleash terrifying energy. Forensic engineers estimate the tank failed at 50 psi, the same pressure as a modern fire hose, but with no one to aim it. The final irony: molasses is now a standard industrial adhesive, used to bond materials that, unlike the tank, are built to last. Today, the flood site is a bland recreational park. No statues, no museum, just a single plaque smaller than a dinner plate. The plaque's inscription is vague, calling it an accident. No mention of greed, negligence, or the 21 lives erased. Survivors' descendants still leave sticky buns or bottles of syrup here, a quiet protest against history's sanitized version. Local historians argue the flood deserves a memorial like the Titanic's, but corporations buried the truth as effectively as the molasses buried victims. In 2019, a commemorative coin was minted, but it depicted the tank, not the dead, as if honoring the wrong culprit. The only real monument, the Molasses Flood's legal legacy, now cited in lawsuits against BP, PG&E and other industrial giants. And if you listen closely at the plaque, some swear you can still hear it, the creak of bending metal, the roar of sweetness turned savage. A century later, the Molasses Flood remains a warning, not about sugar, but about how easily greed turns the ordinary into the lethal. We like to believe tragedies have villains, but the tank had no mustache-twirling monster, just shortcuts taken, warnings ignored. The dead weren't killed by molasses, they were killed by the same thing that drowns us today, the myth that profit outweighs risk. Boston's streets may no longer stick, but the laws born from this disaster still hold corporations to account when we choose to enforce them. So the next time you hear a strange creak in a machine, a bridge, or the system itself, remember, sweetness rots faster than steel rusts. Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more fascinating stories from Recall the Chronicles. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.